I raised my son to believe that education was the one thing no one could ever take away from him. I used to tell him that when he was little, usually late at night when the house was quiet and money worries felt louder than they should. I was a single mother by the time he turned 9, and everything after that felt like a careful balancing act between love and survival. Some months I got it right. Other months I barely stayed upright. But one thing I never questioned was that my sacrifices were worth it if they helped him build a better life. By the time he finished high school, I was already tired in a way sleep never fixes. My back ached more, my hands stayed stiff in the mornings, and my bank account never quite recovered from emergencies. Still, when he told me he'd been accepted into a college 2 hours away, I cried like I'd won the lottery. Not because we were rich or prepared, but because he sounded hopeful. He sounded proud of himself, and that was everything to me. He said he tried for scholarships. He said he'd applied for aid. He said he was working part-time. And then, carefully, almost apologetically, he told me it still wasn't enough. There were fees, books, housing costs he hadn't expected. He didn't ask outright at first. He just let the silence stretch until I filled it, the way I always had. I told him I'd help. I didn't even look at my account balance before I said it. I already knew it wouldn't be easy. What I didn't know was how deep that promise would cut. The first transfer was small, just enough, he said, to cover books, then another for a deposit, then rent, then a sudden, unexpected fee that came with a tight deadline. Each time he sounded stressed, embarrassed even. I could hear the strain in his voice, and it made me feel useful again, needed, like maybe all the years of scraping by were finally paying off in purpose. I started dipping into savings I'd sworn I'd never touch, money I'd put aside slowly, painfully, telling myself it was for emergencies or old age. I told myself this was an emergency. I told myself this was my son's future. I told myself a lot of things to quiet the small voice that asked why it felt like so much, so fast. He came home less often after moving out. When he did, he was distracted, glued to his phone, stepping outside to take calls. I told myself that was normal. College changes kids. Independence changes them. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly. There was a girl, of course. There's always a girl. He mentioned her casually one evening, like an afterthought. A classmate, smart, ambitious, from a good family. He said her name quickly and moved on. I asked if she'd like to come by sometime. He said maybe. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I didn't think much of it then. I wish I had. The money requests continued. My savings shrank. My anxiety grew. I started skipping small comforts without telling anyone. No new shoes, no doctor visits unless absolutely necessary. I told myself it was temporary. Once he graduated, things would ease. Once he found his footing, I'd breathe again. The first crack came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you don't expect your life to split open. I ran into a coworker's niece at the grocery store. She recognized me immediately, said she knew my son, said they went to the same college. I smiled, proud, ready to hear about his classes or his job. Instead, she tilted her head and said, "I didn't know he was engaged." The word didn't register at first. Engaged. It floated between us like a foreign language. I laughed, actually laughed, and said she must be mistaken. She looked confused, then embarrassed. She pulled out her phone before I could stop her and showed me a picture. It was my son, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. And on his fingered hand, wrapped tightly around another woman's waist, was a ring box, open. The woman beside him leaned into his chest, her hand held up proudly. A diamond caught the light. I remember the store going quiet, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought I might faint between the cereal aisle and the frozen foods. I didn't confront him right away. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd helped him with homework, where I'd balanced bills and whispered prayers. I stared at my bank statements. I did the math slowly, carefully, like maybe if I took my time, the truth would soften. It didn't. The numbers told a story I hadn't wanted to read. Large withdrawals timed too neatly with the months leading up to the engagement, amounts that didn't line up with textbooks or rent, amounts that lined up perfectly with a ring I was never meant to see. I called him that night. My hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down between rings. When he answered, his voice was cheerful, light, like nothing in the world was wrong. I asked if how school was going. I asked if he was managing okay. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. There was a pause, just long enough. Then he sighed and said, "Mom, it's complicated." That was the moment I knew my life had changed, not because of the money, not even because of the lie, but because the boy I raised decided I was someone it was acceptable to deceive, and the worst part was still ahead of me.
I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we'd had over the past year, every request for money, every strained thank you. I kept hearing his voice saying, "It's complicated," like that phrase alone could soften what he'd done. By morning, my chest felt tight, my head aching, but my resolve had settled into something cold and steady. I needed answers, and I needed them from him, not rumors, not photos passed between strangers. When he came home that weekend, I almost didn't recognize him. He walked in with confidence I wasn't used to seeing, shoulders back, chin lifted. He hugged me, quick and distracted, then dropped his bag by the door like this house was just a stopover now. I studied his hands without meaning to, the same hands I used to hold crossing the street, the same hands that had slipped a ring onto someone else's finger with my money. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't ask if he was hungry. I just asked him to tell me the truth. At first, he tried to downplay it. He said yes, he was engaged, but it wasn't official yet. He said he hadn't told me because he knew I'd worry. He said the money was still for school, mostly. Mostly. That word burned. I asked him when he planned to tell me. He shrugged and said, "After things settled." I asked him why he lied. He said he didn't see it as lying, more like postponing the truth. I asked him if he understood what that money meant to me. He looked uncomfortable then, finally. He said he knew I'd helped a lot. A lot. Like I'd loaned him a sweater, not emptied my future. When I asked about the ring, his face hardened. He said it was none of my business how he spent his money. I reminded him it wasn't his money. His jaw tightened. He said I'd given it to him. I said I'd given it for college. He said plans change. That's when the anger broke through my calm. I told him about the savings account, about the things I'd gone without, about the nights I'd lay awake worrying if I'd ever be able to retire. I asked him if he knew what it felt like to realize your own child saw your sacrifices as optional. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was defensive, sharp. He said I was being dramatic. He said other parents help their kids all the time. He said his fiancée needed security, that starting a life required investment. Investment, like I was a bank, not a mother. I asked him about her then. Asked him what kind of woman would be comfortable accepting a ring bought with money meant for education, money taken under false pretenses. His eyes flashed. He told me not to judge her. He told me she didn't like how involved I was. He told me she thought I was controlling. That word landed harder than any insult. Controlling. For wanting honesty, for wanting respect, for expecting my child not to lie to my face. I asked him if she knew where the money came from. He hesitated. That was answer enough. He left that night angry, saying we'd talk later. But later never came. Instead, I heard from him less. When I did, it was short, strained. He said he was busy. He said wedding planning was stressful. Wedding planning. A wedding I hadn't been invited to discuss, let alone attend. A few weeks later, I finally met her. Not by invitation, but by accident. They walked into a cafe near my workplace, laughing, hands intertwined. I froze when I saw them. I don't know what possessed me to approach, but my feet moved before my heart could catch up. She was beautiful in a polished way, confident, eyes sharp and assessing. When my son introduced me, her smile was thin, polite in the way people are when they don't plan to know you long. She barely looked at me as she sipped her coffee. When she did speak, it was to comment on how stressful it was to deal with family expectations. I realized then she didn't despise me because she knew me. She despised me because I represented accountability. I represented the truth behind the lifestyle she was stepping into. She excused herself quickly. My son followed. He didn't look back. I went home and cried until my chest hurt. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet ones, the kind that sneak up on you when you realize you're mourning someone who's still alive. I wasn't just grieving the money. I was grieving the relationship I thought we had, the trust I believed was unbreakable. For a while, I considered letting it go, telling myself this was just a phase, that love makes people foolish, that one day he'd understand. But every time I looked at my bank balance, every time I skipped something I needed, resentment crept in. Not because he was building a life, but because he'd built it on my silence. The breaking point came when he called again asking for more. He said tuition had increased. He said he was short. He said it would just be temporary. Something in me finally snapped into clarity. I told him no. The word felt foreign, heavy, but also freeing. He argued. He guilted. He reminded me of all the times I'd helped before. I reminded him of the ring. I reminded him of the lie. He accused me of trying to sabotage his happiness. I told him happiness built on deceit wasn't something I could afford anymore. He hung up on me. Weeks passed, then months. I heard about the wedding through others. I wasn't invited. I wasn't mentioned. My absence was explained away as distance or differences. No one said the word betrayal, but it sat heavy in every conversation. I spent those months rebuilding something quieter inside myself. I picked up extra shifts. I started putting small amounts back into savings, even if it took longer than I'd like to admit. I learned to sit with the grief without letting it define me. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean financing their lies. The day after his wedding, he sent me a message. Just a photo. Him and his wife, smiling. No caption, no apology. Just proof that the future I'd paid for had excluded me. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I deleted it. Because the truth I'd finally accepted was this. I could not force my son to value honesty. I could not make him understand sacrifice. But I could choose dignity. I could choose boundaries. And I could choose to stop pouring myself into someone who saw me as a resource instead of a person. That choice hurt. It still does. But it also saved me. And the real consequences of his decisions were only just beginning to surface.
After the wedding, the silence between us grew heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months where my phone stayed quiet except for spam calls and reminders I couldn't afford to ignore. I told myself the distance was temporary, that newlyweds get busy, that life pulls people in different directions. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just distance. This was a choice. I tried to focus on my own life. I woke up early, went to work, came home tired, and repeated the routine like a script I'd memorized. On the outside, I looked fine. On the inside, I was learning how to live with a wound that didn't bleed, but ached constantly. Every time I passed the empty bedroom that used to be his, every time I saw something on sale and instinctively thought of him, the reality settled in again. I had been cut out not just of his wedding, but of his new life. Then the calls started again. The first one came late at night. I almost didn't answer. When I saw his name on the screen, my heart jumped in a way I hated myself for. I picked up, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't waste time on small talk. He said married life was more expensive than he'd expected. He said rent had gone up. He said his wife was struggling to adjust. And then he said the words I knew were coming. He asked if I could help them, just for a little while. I felt something strange then. Not anger, not sadness, just a tired clarity. I told him I couldn't. I reminded him gently, calmly, that my savings were gone, that I was still recovering from the last year, that I needed to think about my own future now. He went quiet. Then his tone changed. He said I was punishing him. He said family was supposed to support each other. He said his wife felt I never accepted her, and this was proof. I asked him if she knew he was calling me. He hesitated again. That pause told me everything. I told him I loved him, but I would not be manipulated anymore. I told him love without respect turns into something ugly, and I refused to be part of that cycle. He hung up without saying goodbye. A week later, I heard from his wife for the first time. She didn't call. She sent a long message. It was polite on the surface, but sharp underneath. She talked about boundaries, about independence, about how parents sometimes struggle to let go. She said they didn't need my money, but they needed my understanding. She ended it by saying she hoped I could be happy for them someday. I read that message over and over. I noticed what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of the lie, no gratitude for what I'd given, no apology, just a quiet expectation that I would accept my new place on the outside and smile about it. I didn't respond. Instead, I started therapy. It wasn't something I'd planned, but one afternoon I found myself sitting across from a stranger talking about my son like he was a ghost, saying out loud that I felt used and then immediately apologizing for feeling that way. The therapist listened without judgment and said something that stayed with me. She said, "You can love someone deeply and still admit they hurt you." That sentence cracked something open in me. I realized how much energy I'd spent minimizing my own pain to protect his image, even in my own mind. I told myself he didn't mean it, that he was young, that he was influenced. All of that might have been true, but it didn't erase the impact. As months passed, the reality of married life began to show on his end. The calls didn't stop entirely. They changed. Less demanding, more uncertain. He talked about stress, about arguments, about how things weren't as easy as he'd imagined. I listened, but I didn't fix. That was new for both of us. One evening, he showed up at my door unannounced. He looked tired, older somehow. He didn't bring his wife. He didn't bring excuses either. We sat in the living room, the air thick with everything unsaid. Finally, he spoke. He said he didn't realize how much I'd given up for him. He said he thought I'd always be there to catch him. He said marriage had forced him to see money differently, to feel the weight of responsibility. He didn't apologize outright, not yet, but his voice lacked the arrogance it once had. I told him I never wanted repayment. What I wanted was honesty. What I wanted was respect. I told him the lie hurt more than the loss of money ever could. He nodded, eyes downcast. For the first time in a long time, he looked like my son again, not someone performing adulthood. He admitted his wife knew the money had come from me, but not the full story. He said she didn't like how close we were. He said he thought hiding things would make life easier. I told him hiding the truth always makes things harder, just later. When he left that night, nothing was magically fixed, but something shifted. He called less for money, more to talk. Short conversations at first, awkward ones, then slightly easier ones. I didn't rush forgiveness. I let it grow slowly, like trust rebuilding itself brick by brick. I still haven't met his wife again. Maybe someday, maybe not. I've learned not to force reconciliation where accountability hasn't fully arrived. I've also learned that setting boundaries doesn't make you cold, it makes you safe. The money I lost is gone. I won't pretend otherwise. There are still days I worry about the future, but there's also a quiet strength now. I know my worth isn't measured by what I can give. I know love doesn't require self-erasure. If my son ever truly understands that, it will be because life taught him, not because I shielded him from consequences. And if there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Supporting your child's future should never mean sacrificing your dignity. Love should be honest, and when it isn't, sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is say no. After that night he came by unannounced, I thought maybe we had reached the turning point. Not a full reconciliation, but a fragile understanding, like ice that hasn't cracked yet, but still makes you walk carefully. For a while, things stayed quiet. He called once every couple of weeks. We talked about safe things, work, weather, a movie he'd seen. Nothing too close to the wound. I didn't ask about money, and he didn't either. I took that as progress. Then life tested that progress the way it always does. One afternoon, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was his wife. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're going to say but are still angry underneath it. She said there had been an emergency. She said my son had been laid off unexpectedly. She said they were behind on rent. I listened without interrupting. She talked fast, explaining circumstances, blaming the economy, blaming bad timing. Then she paused and said she knew things had been strained between us, but this was family, and family helps when things get hard. There it was again, that word, family, always used when someone wanted something. I asked her calmly what she was asking of me. She hesitated, then said they just needed a little help to get through the month, just until things stabilized, just until he found something else. I noticed how she never mentioned the ring, or the wedding, or the lie, only need. I told her I was sorry they were struggling. I told her I hoped he found work soon. Then I told her I couldn't help financially. The silence on the other end stretched long enough to feel deliberate. When she spoke again, the politeness was gone. She said she knew I had savings. She said she didn't understand how a mother could turn her back on her own child. She said maybe this was why their relationship with me was so difficult. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't raise my voice. I told her that my savings were gone because I'd already helped, that I had given everything I could, honestly believing it was for education. I told her I wasn't turning my back on my son, but I was refusing to enable dishonesty anymore. She scoffed. She said I was living in the past. She said marriage meant priorities shift. She said I needed to accept my new role. That's when I realized this wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about control, about expectation, about whether I would continue to shrink myself to keep peace. I told her something I'd practiced in therapy but never said out loud before. I told her my role as a mother didn't require me to destroy myself to support decisions made without me. I told her love without boundaries turns into resentment, and I wouldn't let that happen again. She hung up on me. That night, my son called. He was angry. He said I had embarrassed him. He said his wife felt disrespected. He said things were hard enough without me making it worse. I let him talk until he ran out of words. Then I asked him a question I should have asked a long time ago. I asked him if he believed I deserved to be lied to. There was a long pause, longer than any before. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. He said no. He said he knew he'd messed up. He said he felt caught between me and his wife. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose sides. I was asking him to choose honesty. I told him something else, too. I told him I would always love him, but I would no longer rescue him from the consequences of his choices. I told him adulthood means standing on your own feet, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. He just said he understood. Weeks passed, then months. He found another job, not a great one, not an easy one, but it paid bills. He stopped calling for help and started calling to talk again, sometimes about work, sometimes about frustrations at home. I listened without fixing. That boundary stayed firm. One evening, he came over again. This time, he brought an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, not a repayment plan, not a check, just words. He wrote that he was sorry, that he knew now how much pressure I'd been under, that he hadn't realized how deeply his lie had cut until he'd watched me step back instead of chasing after him. He wrote that marriage hadn't been the fairy tale he expected, and responsibility felt heavier than he had imagined. He wrote that losing my trust scared him more than losing money ever could. I cried reading that letter, not because everything was fixed, but because accountability had finally arrived without being demanded. I told him forgiveness wasn't a single moment, it was a process. I told him we were on that path, but it would take time. He nodded. He didn't rush me. That mattered. As for me, I kept rebuilding, slowly, carefully. I learned how to say no without explaining myself. I learned how to let disappointment exist without turning it into self-blame. I learned that being a good mother doesn't mean being endlessly available at your own expense. Some relationships change shape over time. They don't go back to what they were. They become something else, less idealized, more honest. That's where we are now. And if there's one truth I hold on to, it's this. Love should never require deception to survive. If it does, it's not love that's being protected. It's comfort, and comfort built on lies always collapses eventually. I didn't lose my son, but I did lose the illusion that sacrifice alone guarantees gratitude. What I gained instead was something harder, but more real, mutual respect. And that, I've learned, is worth more than any ring ever could be. Time has a way of settling things, not by erasing what happened, but by showing you what truly lasts. After that letter, after the apologies finally took shape in words instead of excuses, I found myself standing in unfamiliar emotional territory. I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the sharp, burning way I had been. But I wasn't fully healed either. What I felt most days was cautious, hopeful in small, measured doses. My son started coming by more regularly, not out of need, but out of choice. Sometimes he'd help me fix something around the house. Other times we'd just sit and talk, the way we used to when he was younger. Those conversations were different now. He didn't rush them. He listened more than he spoke. When I shared something about my life, my worries, my plans, he didn't dismiss them. That shift told me more than any apology ever could. His marriage, however, remained complicated. I could hear it in the pauses when he spoke about home, in the way his voice tightened when he mentioned arguments over money or expectations. He never badmouthed his wife outright, and I respected that, but it was clear the foundation they'd built had cracks, and those cracks had nothing to do with me. One afternoon, months later, he asked if I'd be willing to meet her again, not casually, not accidentally, properly. He said he thought it was time. He said he wanted things to be better. I didn't answer right away. I sat with the request, feeling the old ache stir in my chest. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect the fragile peace I'd built. Another part of me knew that healing sometimes asks you to be brave in uncomfortable ways. I agreed with one condition. I told him I would not be disrespected, spoken over, or blamed for things that weren't mine to carry. He promised me that wouldn't happen. We met at a small restaurant halfway between our homes, neutral ground. She arrived first, sitting stiffly at the table, hands folded, eyes alert. When she saw me, her expression softened just slightly, not warmth, but something closer to restraint. The conversation started awkwardly. Polite words, safe topics. Then slowly it shifted. She spoke about the pressure she felt to prove herself, about growing up believing stability came from money, not trust, about fearing that if she didn't secure her future early, it could slip away. I listened, not to excuse her actions, but to understand them. When it was my turn, I spoke honestly. I told her how deeply the lie had hurt me, how being excluded made me feel invisible. I told her I wasn't her enemy, but I wasn't a resource to be managed either. She didn't apologize right away, but she didn't interrupt. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. She admitted she'd been threatened by how close my son and I were. She admitted she'd encouraged him to keep things from me, believing it would make their life simpler. She said she hadn't realized the cost. That wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. We didn't leave that restaurant as friends. We left as two women who had finally seen each other clearly without stories whispered in between. Sometimes that's enough to lower the temperature, to stop the war. After that meeting, things improved slowly, not dramatically, just steadily. Holidays became less tense. Invitations started coming again, tentative but genuine. I didn't push. I accepted what was offered and let time do the rest. Financially, I continued rebuilding. It wasn't easy. Some days I resented the years I'd lost, the security I'd sacrificed. But then I reminded myself that bitterness would only keep me tied to the pain. I chose instead to focus on what I could control, my choices, my boundaries, my peace. I learned to talk openly with friends about what had happened, to stop protecting my son's image at the expense of my truth, to say, yes, I helped him, yes, it went wrong, and yes, I'm still standing. That honesty brought unexpected comfort. I wasn't alone. So many parents carry quiet regrets, silent sacrifices, stories they're afraid to tell. As for my son, he changed, not overnight, but consistently. He stopped asking me to compromise myself. He started asking how I was. He began to understand that adulthood isn't just about independence from parents, but responsibility towards them too. One day, almost a year after the wedding, he surprised me. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a modest check, not nearly what I'd given him, not enough to fix everything. But it wasn't about the amount. It was about the gesture. He told me he wanted to contribute, even if it took years. He told me it mattered to him that he knew I hadn't forgotten. I didn't cash that check right away. I held it for a long time. Then I put it into my savings, not because I needed the money immediately, but because it symbolized something restored, accountability, respect, growth. Looking back now, I see the story more clearly than I ever could in the middle of it. I see a mother who gave too much without asking enough questions. I see a son who confused love with entitlement. I see a marriage that started with secrecy and had to learn honesty the hard way. And I see myself finally choosing balance over blind sacrifice. If there's one message I hope stays with you, it's this. Helping your child should never come at the cost of your own future. Love is generous, yes, but it must also be wise. Boundaries don't destroy families, they save them. I didn't lose my son to a ring. I nearly lost myself to silence. And choosing to speak, to stop giving blindly, was the bravest thing I've ever done.
As the seasons changed, so did something inside me. I hadn't noticed it at first because growth rarely announces itself. It happens quietly, in the way your shoulders relax without you realizing, in the way your breath comes easier when you stop bracing for the next disappointment. I was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was learning how to live without that constant tension. My relationship with my son settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't the closeness we once had, the kind where he told me everything without hesitation, but it was honest. And honesty, I'd learned, was far more sustainable than forced intimacy. We spoke openly now, even when the conversations were uncomfortable, especially then. One afternoon, he asked me something that surprised me. He asked how I had managed on my own for so long, not in a passing way, but with genuine curiosity. He wanted to know how I'd raised him alone, worked full-time, paid bills, and still found the energy to show up emotionally. As I spoke, I realized he was hearing my story for the first time, not as a child, but as an adult, not as someone entitled to my strength, but as someone humbled by it. That conversation changed something between us. I saw it in the way he thanked me afterward, not a quick "thanks, Mom," but a quiet acknowledgement that felt earned. He said he never really understood what I'd carried until he had responsibilities of his own. He said marriage had forced him to see the cost of choices in a way he never had before. I didn't respond with "I told you so." I didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. His wife, too, began to shift in subtle ways. She didn't suddenly become warm or affectionate, but she grew more respectful. She asked before making plans. She included me in conversations instead of speaking around me. Once, she even asked for my advice about something small, insignificant on the surface, but to me it meant everything. It meant she no longer saw me as a threat. I remained cautious. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself just because time passes. It rebuilds through consistency, through actions that align with words. And while things were improving, I stayed grounded in the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. Financially, life remained modest. I adjusted my expectations. I learned to find joy in simpler things: a quiet morning with coffee, a walk after work, a phone call with a friend who understood without explanation. I stopped measuring my worth by what I could provide for others and started valuing what I could preserve for myself. There were moments, of course, when the old hurt resurfaced. A memory, a passing comment, a photo that reminded me of what I'd missed. But those moments didn't undo me anymore. They passed like waves instead of storms. One evening, my son called to tell me they were struggling again, not financially this time, but emotionally. He admitted they were in counseling. He admitted marriage was harder than he'd imagined. I listened without judgment. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't step in to mediate. I let him own his journey. After we hung up, I sat quietly, reflecting on how far we'd come, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. And reality, I'd learned, is far kinder than illusion. I thought often about the savings I'd lost, about the years it might take to rebuild what was gone. But I also thought about what that loss had taught me. It had forced me to confront patterns I'd ignored, the habit of giving until there was nothing left, the belief that love required self-sacrifice without limits, the fear that saying no would make me unlovable. Those beliefs no longer ruled me. I began making plans for myself again, small ones at first, a short trip, a class I'd always wanted to take, things I'd postponed for decades because someone else's needs always came first. It felt strange, almost selfish at times, but with each step I felt more like myself. One day, my son asked what I wanted for my birthday. I told him the truth. I said I wanted time, not money, not gifts, just time together. He showed up that weekend and spent the day with me. We cooked, we laughed, we talked about ordinary things, and for the first time in a long while, the past didn't hang between us like a shadow. I realized then that healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means carrying it differently, with wisdom instead of resentment, with boundaries instead of bitterness. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt guilty for saying no to your child, I want you to hear this clearly. Saying no doesn't make you a bad parent, it makes you a human one. Love isn't proven by how much you give until it hurts. It's proven by how honestly you show up, even when it's hard. My son needed responsibility. I needed restraint. We both needed to grow. And while I wish the lesson didn't cost me so much, I know now that the cost of staying silent would have been far greater. I would have lost myself completely. Instead, I found my voice. That, more than anything, is what I choose to hold on to.
By the time another year had passed, I could finally look back on everything without my chest tightening the way it used to. The memories were still there, clear and sharp, but they no longer controlled my breathing or my sleep. They felt like chapters that belonged to my life instead of wounds that defined it. That shift didn't happen all at once. It came through dozens of small moments where I chose myself when old habits urged me to disappear. My son started calling me not just when things were difficult, but when they were good, too. He'd tell me about small wins at work, about a project he'd handled well, about learning how to budget properly for the first time in his life. He laughed more when we talked. There was less tension in his voice, less defensiveness. I could hear maturity settling in, the kind that only comes from facing consequences without someone rescuing you. One evening, he admitted something that surprised me. He said that when I stopped giving him money, he'd been furious. He said he felt abandoned, like I'd suddenly changed the rules. But over time, he realized the rules had always been there. He just hadn't wanted to see them. He said struggling forced him to confront parts of himself he'd ignored. Entitlement, avoidance, fear. I listened quietly, letting him speak without interruption. When he finished, I told him I never wanted to hurt him. I just couldn't keep hurting myself. He nodded and said he finally understood the difference. His marriage continued to be a work in progress. Some weeks were better than others. There were still disagreements, still moments where old patterns tried to creep back in. But I noticed something important. He no longer hid things from me. When money was tight, he didn't ask. He adjusted. When tensions rose at home, he didn't blame me. He owned his part. His wife, too, changed in her own way. She became less guarded, more open to conversation. One afternoon, she invited me over for dinner, not out of obligation, but intention. I could tell by the way she'd planned it carefully, asking ahead of time what I liked, making sure I felt comfortable. It wasn't perfect, but it was sincere. During that dinner, she thanked me. Not elaborately, not emotionally, just a simple acknowledgement that she knew I'd helped them more than she'd realized at the time. She said she'd been afraid of losing control over her future and hadn't understood the cost of that fear. I appreciated the honesty. It mattered. Afterward, as I drove home, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on everything going right, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes next. I also noticed how differently I showed up in other relationships. At work, I stopped taking on extra responsibilities without recognition. With friends, I spoke up when something bothered me instead of swallowing it. I no longer felt responsible for managing everyone else's emotions. That alone changed my life more than I'd anticipated. There were moments of guilt, of course. Mothers are conditioned to feel them deeply. Sometimes I wondered if I could have handled things better, spoken sooner, prevented the fallout altogether. But then I reminded myself that growth often comes through discomfort, and that my son's mistakes were not evidence of my failure, but part of his journey. One afternoon, while cleaning out old paperwork, I found statements from the account I'd emptied for him. Seeing those numbers still stung. I won't pretend it didn't, but instead of spiraling, I allowed myself to feel the sadness and then let it pass. I folded the papers, placed them in a file, and closed the drawer. That felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected.
I began thinking about legacy differently, not in terms of money or inheritance, but values, honesty, accountability, self-respect. I realized that by finally standing up for myself, I'd modeled something far more valuable than financial support ever could. My son saw it too. One day he told me he'd started a separate savings account, not for emergencies, but for responsibility. He said he never wanted to put anyone in the position he'd put me in again. Hearing that felt like a quiet victory, not because I'd won, but because he'd learned. As for me, I stopped apologizing for my boundaries. I stopped explaining them unless I wanted to. I learned that people who respect you don't need lengthy justifications. They listen the first time. If there's something I wish I'd known earlier, it's this. Love doesn't mean limitless access. It means mutual care. It means truth. And sometimes it means stepping back so someone else can step forward on their own. I don't regret helping my son pursue education. I regret only that I didn't insist on honesty from the beginning. But regret doesn't live here anymore. Wisdom does. When I look at my life now, it's quieter, smaller in some ways, but it's also stronger. I feel grounded. I feel present. I feel like myself again. And if my story resonates with you, if you've ever given until it hurt and then felt guilty for stopping, please know this. Choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you whole. That lesson cost me dearly, but it gave me something priceless in return. There's a strange quiet that comes after everything settles. Not the silence of avoidance or distance, but the calm that follows when storms finally pass and you're left standing, a little bruised, a little wiser, and still breathing. That's where I found myself as another year began. I wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. I wasn't bracing for requests. I was living. I started noticing how differently I moved through my days. I woke up without dread. I planned weeks ahead without worrying that an unexpected call would undo everything. I allowed myself small pleasures without guilt, the kind of things I'd always postponed because someone else's needs came first. It felt almost rebellious at first, choosing myself so deliberately, but over time, it felt natural. My son continued to grow into his responsibilities. He didn't announce it, he showed it. He talked about budgeting, about learning to live within limits. He mentioned turning down things he wanted because they weren't practical yet. Each time he said something like that, I felt a quiet sense of relief. Not pride exactly, more like reassurance that the lesson had stuck. One afternoon, he asked me something unexpected. He asked if I ever resented him. The question caught me off guard. I took a moment before answering, letting myself be honest. I told him there were moments when I felt hurt, moments when I felt taken for granted, but resentment, I explained, only grows when pain isn't acknowledged, and once he started acknowledging it, the resentment lost its place. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then he apologized again, not with guilt or defensiveness, but with clarity. He said he understood now that love shouldn't come with deception, that he'd confused generosity with obligation, that he'd been wrong. I didn't need anything else from him in that moment. Hearing him say those words without being prompted felt like closure. His wife and I maintained a careful but respectful relationship. We weren't close, but we weren't hostile either. We existed in the same family space without tension, and that was enough. Sometimes peace looks like mutual distance paired with courtesy, not forced intimacy. I learned to accept that. Financially, I kept rebuilding, slowly, patiently. There were days I still worried about the future, but there were also days I felt proud of how far I'd come with so little support. I'd learned how to stretch, how to plan, how to trust myself again. That confidence mattered more than numbers in a bank account. One evening, while sorting through old photographs, I came across pictures from when my son was little, birthday parties, school plays, moments frozen in time where my sacrifices were invisible because love filled every frame.
I sat with those images for a long time, letting the memories wash over me. I realized then that none of those years were wasted, even the painful ones. They shaped us, they taught us, they led us here. I also realized something else. Parents are rarely taught how to let go in healthy ways. We're praised for giving endlessly, for putting ourselves last, for enduring quietly, but no one prepares us for the moment when giving too much starts to damage both sides of the relationship. No one tells us it's okay to stop. I wished I'd known sooner that boundaries are a form of love, not rejection, not punishment, love. As time went on, my son began asking for advice again, not financial advice, but life advice, how to handle stress, how to communicate better, how to balance work and home. I answered when I could, always reminding him that the choices were his, that I trusted him to make them. That trust felt different now. It wasn't blind, it was earned. One day he told me they were thinking about starting a family. The word stirred something deep inside me, joy, fear, hope, all tangled together. I told him gently that parenthood teaches lessons no one can fully explain ahead of time, that it humbles you, that it stretches you, that it forces you to confront your own patterns. He listened carefully. I could see him imagining the weight of those words. After we hung up, I sat quietly, reflecting on how far we'd come, from lies and distance to honesty and cautious closeness, from resentment to respect. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been quick, but it had been real. If you're listening and you're in the middle of a similar situation, feeling torn between love and self-preservation, I want you to know something. You are allowed to protect your future. You are expected to expect honesty. You are allowed to step back when giving becomes damaging. Doing so doesn't mean you love less. It means you love wisely. I didn't lose my son to a ring. I found myself through the loss. And in finding myself, I gave him the space to grow into someone better. That's the kind of ending no one talks about. Not dramatic, not perfect, but true. And sometimes, truth is the most powerful closure of all. As the idea of my son becoming a parent himself slowly settled into reality, I found my perspective shifting yet again. Life has a way of circling back, of offering you a mirror when you least expect it. I wasn't thinking about grandchildren yet. Not seriously, but the possibility lingered in the back of my mind like a quiet question. Would he remember what it felt like to depend so completely on someone else? Would he understand the weight of responsibility he once placed on my shoulders without realizing it? We talked more during that period, often about nothing in particular. Sometimes about work stress, sometimes about plans they were making, tentative and cautious. He seemed more thoughtful now, more aware of consequences. I noticed he asked before assuming. That alone told me how deeply the experience had changed him. One afternoon, he admitted something that brought a lump to my throat. He said he used to believe parents existed to fix problems, that it was just part of the role. He said it took losing that safety net to understand how much trust and generosity had been built into it. He said he was ashamed it had taken pain for him to learn that lesson. I told him shame wasn't necessary if learning followed. I told him mistakes are only wasted when we refuse to grow from them. His wife joined that conversation later that evening. She spoke less, but when she did, it was carefully chosen. She said she'd grown up watching financial insecurity tear her own family apart. That fear had shaped her more than she'd realized. She said she'd believed control equaled safety. Hearing her say that helped me understand her better, even if it didn't excuse what happened. Understanding doesn't mean forgetting, but it does soften the edges. Around that time, I faced a scare of my own, a health issue that required tests and waiting and long nights filled with worry. I didn't tell my son right away,
Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted to handle it without automatically leaning on him. That was another lesson I was still learning. Independence goes both ways. When I did tell him, he showed up, not with panic or guilt, but with presence. He drove me to appointments. He sat quietly in waiting rooms. He didn't try to take over. He just stayed. That meant more to me than any amount of money ever could. The tests came back manageable, nothing life-altering, but enough to remind me that time is precious, that relationships deserve care, not control, that the way we treat each other in moments of vulnerability leave lasting impressions. After that experience, my son changed again, subtly. He checked in more often. He asked how I was feeling, really feeling, not just out of obligation. I didn't use that care as leverage. I accepted it as a gift freely given. We talked openly about the past then, more honestly than ever. He admitted he'd been afraid to face me after the truth came out, afraid of my disappointment, afraid of losing my respect. I told him he'd come close, not by the lie itself, but by refusing to take responsibility at first. I told him the moment he chose honesty, he'd begun to earn it back. He listened. He didn't argue. As months passed, I noticed how differently I spoke to myself. I no longer called myself foolish for trusting him. I no longer replayed the decisions that led me there. I'd learned that self-compassion is part of healing too, that blaming yourself keeps you tied to the pain just as tightly as blaming others. I began volunteering a little at a community center, helping older women with budgeting and paperwork. Many of them had stories like mine, children who took advantage, families who blurred boundaries. We didn't dwell on bitterness. We shared lessons. We laughed. We supported each other. In helping them, I realized something profound. My experience wasn't just a private wound, it was a shared one, and sharing it transformed it into something useful. One afternoon, as I walked home from the center, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was perfect, but because I'd found meaning in the pain. I'd turned loss into wisdom. My son called that evening to tell me they were pregnant. The news landed softly, not with shock or fear, but with a quiet sense of readiness. I congratulated him. I told him I was happy for them, and I meant it. After we hung up, I sat alone and let the moment settle. I thought about the cycle of giving, of learning, of boundaries. I hoped he would remember what this journey had taught him when it was his turn to give. I hoped he would balance generosity with honesty. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. You can't protect your children from every mistake, but you can model how to take responsibility when mistakes happen. You can show them that love doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just changes shape. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know I will meet it as myself, not as a bank, not as a safety net, but as a mother who learned when to give and when to stop. And that knowledge feels like the greatest inheritance of all. When the news of the pregnancy settled into my life, it did so gently, without the rush of fear or expectation that might have overwhelmed me years earlier. I was happy, genuinely so, but I was also calm. I didn't immediately imagine babysitting schedules or financial contributions or how I might be needed. That surprised me. It told me how much I had changed. My son and his wife invited me over a few weeks later. They wanted to talk, really talk, not about money, not about logistics, about the future, about boundaries, about expectations. Sitting across from them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, being considered, not assumed. They told me they wanted to do things differently. They said they didn't want to repeat patterns they'd seen growing up. They said they wanted their child to see honesty modeled early, not learned the hard way. Hearing that brought a quiet ache to my chest, the good kind, the kind that comes with hope. I told them I was there for emotional support, for love, for presence, but I was honest too. I told them I wouldn't be stepping into the role of rescuer. I told them I trusted them to build their own foundation. They nodded. No resistance, no defensiveness, just understanding. As the months passed, I watched them prepare for parenthood in ways that reassured me. They budgeted carefully. They argued, yes, but they resolved things without hiding. My son called me sometimes, not to ask for help, but to ask how I handled certain fears when he was young. I shared what I could, always reminding him that there's no perfect way to do this, only an honest one. There were moments when old instincts stirred. When they mentioned costs or stress or uncertainty, I felt the familiar urge to step in, to offer more than advice. Each time I paused, I reminded myself that love doesn't have to look like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like trust. My health scare earlier that year had left me more reflective. I began organizing my affairs in small ways, not out of fear, but responsibility. I updated paperwork. I made plans. I thought about the future with clarity instead of avoidance. That brought me peace I hadn't expected. The baby arrived on a quiet morning. My son called me, his voice shaking with emotion. I could hear joy and terror tangled together. I smiled to myself, remembering that feeling well. When I finally met my grandchild, I held that tiny life and felt the full circle of it all. Love, vulnerability, responsibility, all wrapped into something impossibly small. Looking at my son holding his child, I saw understanding flicker across his face. Not all at once, not fully formed, but present. I knew then that some lessons can only be learned by standing where someone else once stood. In the weeks that followed, I helped in ways that felt right. I cooked meals. I watched the baby while they showered or slept. I didn't take over. I didn't overextend. I gave what I could without disappearing into it. That balance felt like victory. One evening, as we sat quietly while the baby slept, my son thanked me again, not just for helping now, but for stepping back when it mattered. He said if I hadn't done that, he might never have learned how to stand on his own. Hearing that made every difficult moment worth it. I thought back to the woman I'd been at the beginning of this story, tired, afraid, willing to give everything without question. I felt compassion for her. She did the best she could with what she knew then, and when she learned better, she did better. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's too late to change patterns, it's not. Growth doesn't have an age limit. Boundaries don't have an expiration date. You are allowed to redefine love at any stage of your life. I didn't lose my son to a ring. I nearly lost myself to silence and fear. But by choosing honesty and dignity, I found a relationship that, while imperfect, is real. And now, when I look at my grandchild, I don't see a reason to give endlessly. I see a reason to model balance, to show that love and self-respect can exist side by side. That may be the greatest lesson I ever pass on. As life settled into its new rhythm, I found myself reflecting more often on quiet mornings, the kind where the house is still, where memories don't rush in all at once but arrive gently, like light through a window. I used to fear those moments. Silence made space for regret. Now silence felt earned. Becoming a grandmother shifted something deep inside me. It wasn't the overwhelming sense of responsibility I once carried as a mother. It was softer, wiser. I could love without losing myself. I could show up without erasing my own needs. That difference mattered more than I ever expected. I watched my son struggle through sleepless nights, uncertainty, and self-doubt. I saw him question whether he was doing enough, whether he was getting it right. And in those moments, I didn't rush in to fix anything. I simply reminded him that caring enough to worry already made him a better parent than he realized. Those were words I wish someone had said to me years ago. His wife grew more open with me, too. We never became inseparable, but we found a respectful understanding. She admitted that she'd misjudged me early on, mistaking my generosity for control, my concern for interference. I admitted I'd been too eager to prove my worth through sacrifice. We met somewhere in the middle, not as friends, but as two women who wanted the best for the same child. Time softened what anger couldn't. One afternoon, while rocking my grandchild to sleep, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for everything that had gone wrong, not because pain is necessary, but because it forced growth that comfort never could. If my son had never lied, if I had never been hurt, we might have continued on a path built on quiet resentment and unspoken expectations. Instead, everything cracked open, and through those cracks, honesty finally entered. I began sharing my story more openly at the community center, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I told other parents that helping your children should never require disappearing yourself. I told them love doesn't mean unlimited access, it means mutual respect. Some cried, some nodded in recognition. A few said they wished they'd learned that sooner. I told them it's never too late. I also learned to forgive myself fully. That was the hardest part, letting go of the voice that said I should have known better. I realized that trust is not a flaw. It only becomes dangerous when we refuse to adjust after it's broken. I adjusted. I learned. I survived. My son once asked me if I regretted giving him the money. The question caught me off guard. After a long pause, I answered honestly. I told him I regretted the silence that followed more than the money itself. I regretted not speaking up sooner. I regretted believing that being a good mother meant swallowing my pain. He nodded, understanding more than he ever had before. Now, when I look back on that moment when I discovered the truth about the ring, it no longer defines me. It's just one chapter. A painful one, yes, but not the whole story. The ending is quieter, stronger, grounded in self-respect. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple, but not easy. Love your children deeply, support them, believe in them, but never teach them that love requires self-erasure. Never show them that your boundaries are optional, because one day they'll carry those lessons into their own lives. I didn't raise my son to betray me. I raised him to learn, and in the end, he did. As I hold my grandchild now, I whisper promises I never made aloud before, that I will love fiercely, but wisely, that I will give freely, but not at the cost of my own peace, that I will be present, not powerless. And for the first time in a long time, those promises feel unbreakable. There are moments now, usually late at night when the house is quiet again, when I think about how close I came to losing myself completely. Not losing my son, not losing money, but losing the woman I was before I believed my worth was measured only by what I could give away. Those thoughts don't bring pain anymore. They bring clarity. I remember the exact night I finally closed that chapter in my heart. I was sitting at my small dining table, the same one where I once spread out bank statements and tried to convince myself that love justified everything. This time, there were no papers, just a cup of tea gone cold and the steady hum of the refrigerator. I realized I wasn't replaying arguments in my head. I wasn't rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I was simply present, and that felt like freedom.
My relationship with my son is different now. Not distant, not strained, but honest. He no longer asks for help in ways that make me feel cornered. When he does need something, he asks plainly, and he accepts my answer, whether it's yes or no. That change alone tells me how much he has grown. Respect doesn't arrive with grand apologies. It shows up quietly in behavior. Sometimes he brings up the past himself, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge them. He'll say things like, "I didn't understand back then," or "I was so focused on my life that I forgot you had one too." I don't need more than that. Accountability spoken without defensiveness is its own kind of healing. His wife has softened as well. Motherhood humbled her in ways I recognize. She once confessed, during a rare moment of vulnerability, that she'd been afraid of me, afraid of my presence, my history with my son, the bond they shared long before she arrived. I told her fear often disguises itself as dislike. That conversation didn't turn us into close companions, but it built a bridge sturdy enough to stand on. What surprised me most was how my own life expanded once I stopped shrinking it for others. I took a part-time role mentoring younger women at a local nonprofit, many of them mothers juggling sacrifice and survival. They looked at me with the same tired eyes I once saw in the mirror. When I shared my story, I didn't dramatize it. I didn't villainize my son. I simply told the truth. And in that truth, they saw permission to choose themselves without guilt. One woman told me she had been secretly draining her savings to keep her adult children comfortable even when she couldn't afford it. She said she felt invisible in her own life. I told her something I wish someone had told me sooner. Love doesn't require you to disappear. If it does, it isn't love. It's fear wearing a familiar face. I've learned to forgive without forgetting. That balance matters. Forgetting invites repetition. Forgiveness allows peace. I carry both carefully now. On my birthday this year, my son gave me a small box. Inside was a simple necklace, nothing expensive. He told me he paid for it himself, slowly, over time. But what stayed with me wasn't the gift. It was the way he said, "I wanted this to come from me, not from you." In that moment, I knew the lesson had finally landed. Money can be replaced. Trust takes longer. But it can be rebuilt when both sides are willing to stand in the discomfort long enough to change. I no longer feel the urge to explain myself to people who don't understand my choices. I've made peace with the fact that some will always see boundaries as rejection. That's not my burden to carry anymore. My responsibility is to live honestly, not endlessly available. If you're listening to my story and recognizing pieces of your own in it, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to pause before giving. You are allowed to ask questions. And you are allowed to expect honesty from the people you sacrifice for. Being a parent doesn't mean accepting betrayal in silence. It doesn't mean teaching your children that your needs don't matter. The greatest gift we give them is not endless support, but an example of self-respect. I still love my son deeply. That never changed. What changed was the way I love myself alongside him. That balance saved us both. Now, when I sit in the same kitchen where this story began, the light feels different, softer, warmer. I don't flinch at memories anymore. I honor them, then let them pass. This is where my story ends. Not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with strength, clarity, and a quiet kind of peace that only comes when you finally choose yourself. And if my story helps even one person do the same, then every painful step along the way meant something after all.